Personal independence payment. My name's Danielle Zyder. I'm responsible for the day-to-day running of this clinic. I hope that you find this training video useful, but please let me know if you have any further questions. Personal independence payment, or PIP as it's commonly known, is a non-means tested benefit to assist those who have a long-term illness or disability. People can claim PIP on top of other benefits or if they're in work. It's a working age benefit, which means that people can apply for it for the first time if they're over 16 and if they've not yet reached state pension age. Eligibility for PIP is based on how your condition affects your ability to carry out certain activities rather than on the basis that you have a particular condition. There are two separate components. There's the daily living component and the mobility component, and a person may get one or both. Each component has a standard rate and an enhanced rate, and each component is assessed separately, so you could get either rate or nothing for each of the components. If you get the enhanced rate of the mobility component, then rather than receiving the money each month, some people choose to put the mobility component towards a vehicle through the Motability scheme. This is an affordable way for a person with a long-term condition to purchase a suitable car, as tax and insurance are dealt with by the Motability vehicle provider. And whilst there's an expectation that PIP will be used to cover the additional costs of having a disability, there is actually no requirement to spend the benefit in a particular way. So, for example, the mobility component doesn't actually have to be spent on your mobility needs. There's nobody who's going to check up on that, and there's no legal requirement for you to do so. The main rules for PIP are set out in the Social Security Personal Independence Payment Regulations 2013. It can also be useful to look at the Advice for Decision Making and the Assessment Guide for Assessment Providers. These are both published by the DWP and can be useful documents to refer to make sure that the decision makers and the medical assessors have been properly considering all the relevant information when making their decisions. Although the guidance isn't legally binding, it is a useful reference tool. The activities and descriptors are set out in Appendix 2 of the Volunteer Handbook, which you should have access to. Each activity carries a certain number of points, which vary from descriptor to descriptor. A person must get at least 8 points to get the standard rate of a component and 12 points to get the enhanced rate of that component. When you're assisting our clients, the majority of the appeal will be based on demonstrating why an individual should be awarded additional points for particular activities. We'll go through the activities in a little bit more detail later, but just as an example, the first activity for the daily living component is preparing food. If a person can prepare and cook a simple meal unaided, they'll be awarded 0 points. If they need an aid or appliance to be able to either prepare or cook a simple meal, they'll be awarded 2 points. If they can't cook a simple meal using a conventional cooker, but they can do so using a microwave, they'll be awarded 2 points. If they need prompting to be able to prepare or cook a simple meal, for example, due to a mental health condition, they'll be awarded 2 points. If they need supervision or assistance to either prepare or cook a simple meal, they'll be awarded 4 points. And finally, if they can't prepare and cook a food at all, then they'll be awarded 8 points. This is a list of the activities that are looked at when deciding whether an individual is eligible for PIP. With the daily living activities, firstly they look at whether an individual can prepare food, so preparing a simple one-course meal using fresh ingredients. Secondly, they're looking at whether the person has any difficulties with eating and drinking, so it's not looking so much at, for example, whether a person is is really fussy and they'll only eat certain types of food and aren't having a healthy diet, they're not looking at the quality of the diet, they're looking at whether the person can actually ingest food. For example, if somebody needs to be peg fed or have their food pureed, then they're likely to score points for this activity. But if it's just a case of a person not ingesting a healthy, nutritious, balanced diet, then they're unlikely to score any points. With taking medication, managing therapy, or monitoring a health condition, they're looking at whether a person is able to, for example, take their own daily medication every day without any sort of prompting or assistance. With washing and bathing, they're not looking so much at whether the person is able to use the bath and operate the shower. They're looking at whether the person's able to physically wash and bathe themselves, or whether they need prompting to be reminded to bathe on a regular basis. With managing toilet needs or incontinence, they're looking at whether the person has any difficulties with actually using the toilet, whether they need any incontinence aids. Dressing and undressing is looking at the physical activity of getting dressed and whether there are any difficulties with that, but also whether the individual's able to dress appropriately or dress appropriately for the weather. So if somebody needs assistance to know what clothes to wear and when, then they're likely to score 2 points for this activity. With communicating verbally, the assessors are looking at whether the person is able to hear verbal communication. They're not so much looking at whether the person understands what's being said or can understand different tones of voice or sarcasm. They're just looking at whether there's any issues with the physiology of hearing and communicating. With reading, they're looking at whether a person is able to read simple language and understand that. So points are awarded if somebody's unable to read complex information, but the guidance and the definitions of what constitutes complex information are just being able to read and understand one line of text. Engaging with others is something that affects a lot of our clients with learning disabilities in particular, and this is looking at whether people understand verbal communication, physical cues, whether they're able to engage with others safely and without any sort of distress to themselves or others. And finally, managing budgeting decisions is looking at whether people can do things such as set up their own direct debits and manage their own money. It's not looking at things such as whether somebody can remember the PIN number to their bank account. With mobility activities, they're looking at planning and following journeys. So this is something that will apply to a lot of our clients with learning disabilities and autism, is whether they would be able to get from A to B without any sort of support. Would they be able to plan the journey themselves? Would they be able to cope if there was a diversion or a delay to the transport they were using? And quite often this is quite problematic for our clients. Points will be scored if you're able to manage a familiar journey on your own, but not an unfamiliar journey. And if somebody can't even cope with a familiar journey without support, then they will score enough points to receive the enhanced rate of the mobility component. The second activity, moving around, is looking at the physical act of getting from A to B and whether a person has difficulties with that. To be considered able to do an activity, a person has to be able to do it safely, so in a way that's unlikely to cause them or anyone else harm during or after the activity, to an acceptable standard and in a reasonable period of time. So taking no more than twice the time it would take a non-disabled person. They also have to be able to do it repeatedly, as often as needed. So, for example, if a person can cook a meal but they're unsafe doing it because they often cut themselves whilst chopping vegetables and burn food because they forget to check on it whilst it's in the oven, they could be considered unable to do it for the purposes of PIP. You need to think about how the person's ability to do something varies in different environments, different times of day, or from day to day. For example, if somebody could make their way down a street in the middle of the day when nobody's around, but would struggle to do it during rush hour because they can't cope with busy environments due to the noise and number of people, they should be considered unable to do it. Don't forget to think about this for each question and explain how the person's ability to do something changes depending on the circumstances. If an impairment or health condition fluctuates, then the person will be assessed on the basis of how it affects them for the majority of the time. And this is also the case with things such as managing medication. So if somebody isn't on regular medication and only, for example, once a year has to remember to take a prescription, then they're going to be unlikely to get points for managing therapy or monitoring a health condition because it's not something that impacts on them for the majority of the time. Aids and appliances. What are aids and appliances? Well, they're anything that improves, provides or replaces mental or physical function. It includes specialised disability-related equipment such as hearing aids or magnifiers, and it also includes everyday items that anyone could use, but you use them because of your impairment. For example, using a dosset box to store medication because you have difficulty remembering what to take and when, and you struggle to remember if you've already taken your medication. Aids or appliances will be taken into account if either you need to use them to carry out an activity, or the assessor thinks you could reasonably be expected to use them even if you choose not to. If you use an aid or appliance, then you need to explain how it helps you and what the limitations are. If you choose to use an aid or appliance but can actually manage without it, then it won't be taken into account and you won't get the points for using an aid or appliance. Sensitivity is often required when discussing the activities and descriptors with clients and their families. Often this will be the first time that the family or the claimant has come across the descriptors, and quite often they'll have been applying on the misunderstanding that PIP is awarded for a certain disability or condition rather than how that condition affects their ability to carry out the activities. It can be really difficult to go from a positive approach to a temporarily focusing on the can't do. So use language such as on a bad day, on a difficult day, if your helper wasn't here, what would you do? And acknowledge the difficulty. Also, when talking to family members, it can be helpful to ask them to take a step back and think about all the things that they do for the individual. Quite often, this is something that they've been living with for years and years, if not their whole lives. And it's become so normal that they don't realise how much they're doing for the individual and how lost the individual would be without them. It can also be really helpful to ask for the family members or the individual, if they're able to keep a diary of their daily lives, thinking about how long it takes them to do certain activities and just the steps that they need to take to carry out that activity, because often it's just so normal to them that they don't realise the difficulties that they have and the aids and adaptations that they've made to enable them to live their lives to the best of their abilities. Finally, here's an overview of the PIP appeal process. The individual will apply for the benefit, and when the claim's disallowed, they have 1 month from the date of the decision letter to ask for a mandatory reconsideration. If the mandatory reconsideration is unsuccessful, they have 1 month from the date of the mandatory reconsideration letter to appeal that decision. Within 28 days of lodging an appeal, the DWP should send a bundle to the individual, and it's at that point that Access volunteers generally get involved. Generally, we ask the Access volunteers to register as representatives at the tribunal. This doesn't mean that you have to attend the hearing on the day, it just means that you're going to get copies of all the correspondence and documentation in relation to the appeal. You'll then review the bundle and contact the client to discuss which activities and descriptors may apply and if there's anyone who may be able to provide supporting evidence. You'll then write out for supporting evidence. Once the evidence has been received, then you'll draft the submissions and send them to the tribunal with any additional evidence. And finally, you'll help the individual to prepare for the hearing, and if appropriate and there's nobody else to support the individual, such as a friend or family member, then you may choose to attend the hearing. However, this will have to be agreed with Access and also with your pro bono lead. Thank you for listening to this training. If you do have any further questions, then please feel free to contact me. Thank you.